The torches burn low, their smoke curling like serpents against the painted ceilings of a Roman villa hidden deep within the heart of the empire. The air is heavy with the mingled scents of wine incense and human sweat, as though the room itself were intoxicated. Men of senatorial rank lie sprawled across marble couches, their tunics loosen their eyes wide and glassy from draughts of opium and drops of silphium-infused wine. Women of noble birthwives, of generals, daughters of magistrates, move among them like shadows, their hair undone, their laughter sharp and trembling, as if it belongs to someone else. In the center, a priestess cloaked in deep crimson raises a chalice to the painted god Bacchus, her voice a whisper that ripples through the crowd like forbidden music. Bodies tangle and writhe in the flickering gloom, more beast than human now. The frescoes that once depicted mythological revelry seem to come alive under the torchlight satyrs, leering nymphs fleeing Bacchus himself forever, caught in a moment of ecstatic abandon. The walls of the villa close in, suffocating with their silent testimony, and yet in this chamber of shadows, shame is banished, morality discarded, the weight of empire lifted for a fleeting moment. But listen closely beneath the groans, the drunken laughter, the pounding rhythm of fists against bronze drums. There is another sound. It is softer, almost swallowed by the chaos. A door opening, a whispered name, a slave's hurried footsteps as he vanishes down a corridor to carry word of what he has seen. In that single instant, amidst the delirium, fate itself changes course. The ecstasy in this chamber will not remain buried in smoke and song. Rome itself will come to know of it, and Rome will not forgive. Imagine the silence that follows when the torches finally gutter out, when the chalices lie empty, when the worshippers collapse into stupor. The villa will reek of spilled wine and burned resin, but also of fear. Because what you have just witnessed is no mere indulgence, it is a crime in the eyes of the state, one that whispers of conspiracy, of lost control of senators and matrons, bowing not to Caesar, but to Bacchus. One that carries a penalty worse than shame. And so the question lingers in the night air, heavier than incense, sharper than wine. Why would the most powerful men and women of Rome, commanders of armies, heirs of dynasties, guardians of the Republic's laws, risk everything for this? What drove them to surrender reason, to court destruction in the embrace of madness, lust, and drugs? Stay with me. For behind this haze of silphium smoke and opium dreams lies a truth darker than any revelry and a fate more merciless than the god they worshipped. Before the whispers of orgies and forbidden rites, before the shadow of Bacchus loomed over the city, there was only the glittering surface of Rome's golden age. Imagine stepping into the atrium of a senator's villa, marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, a fountain trickling with imported water from aqueducts that stretched across mountains. Slaves move silently, carrying trays of figs, pomegranates, and honey cakes dusted with cinnamon from faraway lands. Every corner of this house hums with wealth, bronze statues from Greece, ivory inlays from Africa, silks from the East. Here, power and luxury breathe together. By day, these men sat in the Senate, wrapped in spotless white togas, their words shaping the empire's laws, their votes deciding the fate of nations. By night, they reclined in triclinium's dining halls, lit by hundreds of oil lamps, where roasted peacocks, oysters from Britannia, and wine sweetened with honey flowed endlessly. Their wives, draped in flowing stolas and adorned with pearls and emeralds, hosted salons where poetry was recited and philosophers debated virtue. From the outside, Rome's elite seemed the embodiment of order, discipline, and civilization. But this gilded world was also a cage. Beneath the surface of refinement lay suffocation. The laws of Rome, crafted to preserve dignity, demanded restraint at all times. Public conduct was policed by censors' morality etched into stone by decree. Even emperors were bound by the expectation of presenting themselves as paragons of Roman virtue. Excess could be displayed only in sanctioned forms, grand games temples or triumphal parades. Private desires, however, were forced underground, hidden behind frescoed walls and silken curtains. The pressure of the empire created its own paradox. These were men who commanded legions, yet they were forbidden to surrender themselves to anything as primal as ecstasy. Women born into dynasties that stretched back to the Republic were trained to embody dignity, chastity, and silence. But the human heart does not bend easily to law. Beneath the marble surface, beneath the careful masks of civility, there pulsed a hunger raw, dangerous, insatiable. A hunger for something beyond power and wealth. And so the silks, the marble, the honeyed wine became only symbols of restraint. Behind closed doors, the gilded cage began to rattle. For what use is a villa adorned with treasures if the soul within is starved? What use is a pearl necklace if the body that wears it is chained by silence? Rome's elite prisoners of their own grandeur began to seek release in places where no censor could see, places where the torchlight burned low, where silphium seeds dissolved into wine, where masks of Bacchus replaced the masks of senators. It is here in this paradox of glory and repression that the seeds of ruin took root. For when a society gilds its cage too brightly, those inside it will claw desperately at the bars, no matter the cost. It began not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. A grain, a drop, a secret passed from hand to hand beneath the marble shadows of Rome. Silphium, an herb more precious than gold, harvested from the rocky coastlines of Cyrene, was already famed as a medicine and a lover's ally. Ground into powders, pressed into oils, dissolved into wine, it became a spark that ignited both passion and freedom. To the respectable Roman matron, it was a discreet safeguard against the burden of unwanted birth. To the reveller seeking escape, it was fire hidden in a cup. And when silphium was joined with opium, imported from the East in tiny clay jars, the results were otherworldly. Imagine the first taste. A senator, weary of endless debates, sipping from a goblet laced with silphium resin, the bitterness masked by honey. Within minutes, his heart beats louder, his skin tingles, a warmth flows through his veins, as though Bacchus himself has embraced him. The chains of law and reputation dissolve. His tongue loosens. His hands reach for things he would never touch under the bright gaze of the forum. And in the corner a priest of Bacchus smiles, because he knows once the seed is planted, there is no return. Rumours spread through the marble corridors of power. Whispers of gatherings where silphium and opium were mixed with wine, until night became a fever dream. Where senators, matrons, and even young heirs of noble houses shed the armour of restraint and surrendered to delirium. Where laughter turned into screams and screams into songs. Some called it liberation. Others muttered that it was blasphemy, a rot spreading in the heart of Rome. But desire is a contagion. The more it was forbidden, the more irresistible it became. Slaves. Once silent shadows carried tales of what they had seen their masters convulsing in ecstasy. Noblewomen shedding silken robes, the torchlight revealing truths that should have remained hidden. These whispers were not confined to taverns or markets. They found their way to the ears of rivals, to political enemies waiting to strike. And yet still the gatherings grew. Because in the silphium smoke and opium haze, Rome's elite discovered something intoxicating beyond the pleasures of flesh. They discovered escape from duty, from dignity, from the crushing weight of the empire. They discovered a world where they were no longer senators or matrons, but mortals trembling at the touch of the divine. But every indulgence carried a shadow. Silphium, harvested to extinction, became scarcer, its price rising with every passing season. Opium, traded along routes from Asia, carried the stench of foreign corruption. And most dangerous of all were the whispers that these secret rites were not simply indulgence, but conspiracy. That Bacchus was gathering an army not of soldiers, but of intoxicated worshippers. And in the corridors of the Senate, whispers of pleasure began to sound like the drumbeats of treason. The seeds had been planted, the roots were spreading, and soon the walls of Rome itself would tremble. The descent from whispers to revelation was swift, like a curtain ripped open in the dead of night. For years, the rites had grown in secret, hidden behind the thick walls of villas and down in the shadowed vaults beneath the city. But secrets have a way of breeding enemies, and in Rome an enemy's tongue could kill as surely as a sword. It was a single testimony that shattered the veil. A frightened youth dragged before the praetors after being caught in a minor theft spilled more than his own sins. He spoke of hidden chambers of nights where hundreds gathered, not in drunken revel, but in wild abandon, drugged into frenzy, shouting invocations to Bacchus. He spoke of powerful men, senators and magistrates, kneeling beside slaves and prostitutes as equals in delirium. He described women, noble matrons, who in daylight embodied virtue, but in torchlight discarded every chain of restraint. His words dripped with terror, and with them the Bacchanalia was no longer a rumour. It was a revelation too explosive to ignore. The Senate reacted with dread. Rome's guardians saw not just lust, but conspiracy. The rites they claimed were breeding grounds for treason, for plots against the Republic itself. What if the intoxicated frenzy was more than indulgence? What if it was a rehearsal for rebellion? The fear of ungoverned pleasure twisted into paranoia about sedition. To the austere guardians of order, the image of Rome's pillars of society surrendering to drug-fueled ecstasy was not only immoral, it was an existential threat. And so the trap was sprung. Soldiers were dispatched into the night, their sandals striking stone alleys as they followed whispered directions. Doors were broken open. Torches flooded the hidden halls. What they found was chaos, men and women mid-revelry, their eyes wide, and clouded bodies smeared with wine and resin limbs entwined in grotesque displays. The priests and priestesses froze in horror, goblets still raised as armed steel cut through the smoke. Panic erupted. Some tried to flee, stumbling half-naked through corridors. Others fell to their knees begging for mercy. The soldiers, cold and unrelenting, dragged them into the streets. Imagine the spectacle: senators stripped of dignity, noblewomen clutching torn robes, their painted faces smeared, paraded past the sneering glares of neighbours. The very people who had commanded respect now became objects of mockery, humiliation, and wrath. In one stroke, what had been indulgence became evidence of crime. What had been a whispered desire became public disgrace. And for those seized, there was no defence. The Senate would not see frightened revellers. It would see conspirators. The gods themselves, so the state proclaimed, were outraged. And if Bacchus demanded blood, then Rome would give it. From this moment, the ecstasy ended. Terror replaced intoxication. The wine cups were shattered, the incense smothered, and the promise of pleasure now led only to the certainty of punishment. What followed was not fire and spectacle, but something colder, quieter, more suffocating. Once the trap had been sprung, Rome did not rush to execution. Instead, it chose to strangle its victims slowly with chains of fear, suspicion, and betrayal. Picture a senator once proud in the forum, now confined to a damp chamber beneath the Capitoline. The marble floors he once strode with confidence are replaced by stone slick with moisture, the air heavy with the stench of mildew and sweat. Shackled his hands, tremble not from age, but from withdrawal, for his body craves the silphium and opium that once drowned his dread. The silence presses against his ears, until even the dripping of water becomes unbearable. He wonders who has betrayed him. Was it a rival? A slave? Perhaps his own wife, whispering in desperation to protect their children. This torment was not his alone. Noblewomen once adorned with jewels and praised for their chastity now languished in dark rooms, their silken stolas torn away, reduced to rags. They remembered the torchlit halls, the music, the ecstasy that freed them for a few precious hours. Now those same memories curdled into nightmares. Every laugh, every touch, every whispered invocation of Bacchus replayed in their minds, but twisted now into evidence proof of guilt that would not be forgiven. Fear seeped into every corner of Rome. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. Slaves who had once silently poured wine and scattered rose petals now found their words sharper than blades. To denounce a master was to purchase one's own safety. To accuse a mistress was to escape the lash. And so tongues wagged in the night, trading secrets for survival. The walls themselves seemed to whisper, carrying tales of what had been seen in those forbidden chambers. The accused left to rot before trial endured not just chains, but isolation. No comfort, no counsel, no familiar face to offer solace. Some prayed to Jupiter, to Juno, to any god who might intercede, only to feel abandoned. Others cursed Bacchus, whose promises of ecstasy had led them here. Still others, half mad with despair, longed only to taste once more the smoke and the wine that had stolen their reason. And over it all hung betrayal. Husbands denounced wives. Wives disowned husbands. Fathers distanced themselves from sons. In Rome, reputation was survival, and blood ties were cut like threads if they endangered the family name. What greater torment could there be than to see one's own kin stand silent, or worse, stand against you, when your life is balanced on the blade of accusation? This was the descent into darkness, not the frenzy of torches and soldiers, but the endless hours of silence, suspicion, and despair. Ecstasy had become agony. What had once promised liberation now delivered only chains. And as the days bled into weeks, the condemned began to understand they were not waiting for justice. They were waiting for doom. When the accused were finally led from their cells, they did not walk into a hall of reason, but onto a stage where the script had already been written. Rome called it justice. In truth, it was theatre, cruel, hypocritical, and designed not to uncover truth, but to preserve the illusion of order. The forum buzzed with anticipation as the trials began. Spectators pressed close, eager for scandal, their voices a low murmur of judgment before a word had been spoken. The accused were paraded forward stripped of dignity, their heads bowed beneath the weight of chains. Senators who had once reclined beside them at banquets now sat on high benches, faces carved into masks of severity. These were the same men who had tasted silphium on their tongues, who had lost themselves in opium haze, but now they wrapped themselves in spotless togas and thundered about morality. False witnesses were summoned, their stories rehearsed, their lies polished until they gleamed like marble. One slave spoke of his mistress writhing in frenzy beneath Bacchus's altar, though his eyes flickered with fear at every word. Another claimed that noblemen plotted treason within the rites, whispering sedition between gulps of wine. Each testimony fed the Senate's hunger not for truth, but for an image Rome as pure Rome, as unsullied Rome, as the eternal guardian of discipline. The accused tried to speak. Some swore their innocence, voices breaking in desperation. Others confessed broken by weeks of chains and solitude, their words trembling with shame. But none of it mattered. The Senate had already decided the Bacchanalia was not merely a crime, it was a disease. And Rome would purge it with fire and blood. The hypocrisy was staggering. Men who in secret had pleaded for more silphium now denounced its very existence. Magistrates who had revelled in torchlit chambers declared themselves defenders of the god's honour. Women who had once laughed in the ecstasy of Bacchus now bowed their heads in silence, fearing the ruin of their families. Justice here was not blind. It was staring with cold, calculating eyes, weighing not evidence but appearances. The punishments were decreed with solemn voices, yet everyone knew the sentences had been etched long before. Some were condemned to death, others to imprisonment, still others to exile, so far that their names would wither on the lips of Rome. The crowd gasped, nodded, and whispered approval. And yet beneath the surface, unease lingered. If Rome could destroy these men and women today, who might it destroy tomorrow? What the Senate called justice was little more than a mask stretched thin over cruelty. The accused were pawns offered up not to protect Rome from danger, but to protect Rome from itself, from the shame of admitting that its own guardians had been the first to fall into delirium. The trials were not about guilt. They were about silence. And silence was the one verdict no prisoner could escape. Dawn came softly, as it always did in Rome, with the pale glow of sunlight spilling through lattice windows. But for those condemned in the Bacchanalia trials, that light carried no promise, only a cruel reminder. This would be the last sunrise they would ever see. Imagine one of them, a patrician woman once draped in silks, now clothed in plain linen. She awakens on a straw mat, her body stiff from the cold stone beneath her. The silence of the prison is broken only by the distant clang of iron doors and the soft scurrying of rats. She lingers in that half-light, staring at the ceiling, knowing that each heartbeat carries her closer to the end. Her hands still remember the weight of a chalice, the warmth of silphium wine sliding down her throat. But those memories now feel like dreams from another life. She is granted a final bath. Guards lead her into a small chamber where a slave, trembling, pours warm water scented faintly with rose oil. Her bruises, hidden beneath the surface, sting in the water's touch. She allows her hair to be combed one last time, the motion slow, ritualistic. The reflection staring back from the polished bronze basin is not that of a matron of Rome, but a ghost in waiting. Her last meal is set before her bread, olives, a small cup of watered wine. She eats little. Each bite tastes of ashes, heavy with the knowledge that her body will not need nourishment again. Between sips she whispers fragments of prayers, not to Jupiter, not to Juno, but to Bacchus, the god who once offered her ecstasy, who once seemed to free her from the iron weight of Roman virtue. Was he a liberator? Or was he the betrayer who led her here? The question gnaws unanswered. She writes though her hands tremble too much to form neat letters, a final note to her children hidden away by her family to escape the stain of her disgrace. She tells them to remember her not as she will die, but as she once lived, laughing beneath the cypress trees, weaving garlands of flowers, whispering lullabies in the stillness of night. She folds the letter, carefully presses it to her lips, and leaves a faint trace of salt from her tears on the papyrus. When the guards return, she does not resist. She gathers her robe around her shoulders, lifts her chin, and walks with slow, measured steps. The corridors echo with her footfalls, each one heavier than the last. Beyond the iron doors, the morning sun has risen fully, its warmth falling upon her face. For a brief moment she closes her eyes and allows herself to feel it, the last caress of light, the final embrace of a world she is about to leave. The day has only begun. For her, it will not end. The forum seethed with anticipation, a living sea of faces, pressed shoulder-to-shoulder murmurs rising like the hum of insects. Rome had always hungered for spectacle gladiators, chariot races, triumphal parades. But this was different. This was not entertainment. This was punishment made public, a warning hammered into the heart of the empire. The condemned were not criminals from the gutter. They were senators, matrons, and heirs of noble houses. And that made their downfall all the more delicious to the crowd. The woman we have followed is led forward, her wrists bound with coarse rope. She does not stumble, though the weight of every gaze burns against her skin. Her linen robe clings to her body damp from fear and morning sweat. Around her march guards, in bronze cuirasses, their spears gleaming beneath the midday sun. The roar of the crowd swells as she reaches the platform, a wooden scaffold erected at the very center of the forum, its beams dark with old stains. Trumpets blare, shrill and merciless, silencing the murmurs. A magistrate steps forward, his toga immaculate, his voice booming with rehearsed righteousness. He proclaims her guilt not in whispers, not in ambiguity, but with thunder. A worshipper of Bacchus, corrupter of women, conspirator against Rome. Each word lashes her like a whip. She does not answer. To speak would be to feed the theatre, to give the crowd another gasp, another ripple of excitement. Instead, she closes her eyes, clinging to the memory of the last sunrise. The executioners approach. Their faces are blank, almost bored, as though this were no more than another chore. One coils a length of rope, thick, rough, merciless. Another brings forth a cord of silk, gleaming pale in the sun, reserved for those of noble blood. Cruel irony, even in death class, dictated the tools of destruction. The crowd leans forward, breaths held as the silk is looped around her neck. She trembles, but her voice does not break when she whispers a final prayer. The platform creaks beneath her feet as the cord tightens. The sound is obscene in its intimacy, the rasp of silk against flesh, the strangled gasp forced from her lungs. Her fingers claw at the rope nails, breaking blood, welling at her fingertips. The sun glitters cruelly upon her tears as her body convulses, fighting a battle that cannot be won. Some in the crowd cheer, their voices shrill with satisfaction. Others avert their eyes uneasy at the sight of a noblewoman reduced to spasms and silence. The magistrates sit unmoved, faces carved from stone. And when her body finally falls limp, when the struggle is over, the executioners release their grip. She hangs for a moment in perfect stillness, her lifeless form swaying gently in the breeze. This was not justice. This was Rome reminding itself and the world that desire could be strangled, that ecstasy could be crushed, that even the most powerful were no stronger than silk when the Senate decreed their end. When the last cries faded, when the rope ceased to creak beneath the weight of the dead, a silence fell upon the forum, so heavy it seemed to smother the very air. The crowd, once raucous with anticipation, stood hushed. Their excitement curdled into unease. Death had been promised, death had been delivered, and yet the spectacle left not triumph but a hollow echo. The magistrates rose from their seats, their white togas still immaculate, untouched by the filth and fear that had soaked the condemned. Without a glance at the lifeless bodies swaying on the scaffold, they turned and departed. Their footsteps rang on marble cold, and certain as though nothing remarkable had occurred. To them, this was duty performed, order restored, theatre concluded. The crowd began to disperse in uneasy murmurs. Some whispered prayers, others spat on the ground. Still, others laughed nervously, mocking the fallen to mask their discomfort. Mothers clutched their children's hands more tightly. Fathers shook their heads and muttered that Rome had been cleansed. But all of them carried away an image they could not forget. Noble faces twisted in agony, silken robes stained with sweat, the bodies of Rome's elite dangling like criminals. Then came the final indignity, the disposal. The executioners, grim and silent, cut the corpses down. The silk cords were coiled and carried away to be used again, as if, even in death, the condemned were denied uniqueness. The bodies were not granted proper funerary rites. No incense, no garlands, no mournful songs of family. They were dragged like refuse to carts, their limbs jerking grotesquely as wheels clattered over cobblestones. Rome would not allow them graves to be honoured. They were to vanish nameless, their remains scattered in pits beyond the city walls. Slaves washed the scaffold with buckets of water, scrubbing away the stains as though they could erase memory itself. The sun bore down mercilessly, drying the blood to dust, bleaching the wood until it looked clean again. By nightfall, the Forum would host another crowd, and this place of execution would be indistinguishable from the place of commerce and debate it had always been. Rome devoured its shame with the efficiency of empire. But silence has its own weight. In the villas that night, families of the condemned dined in grim quiet, their tables suddenly emptier, their names suddenly dangerous to speak aloud. In back rooms, survivors of the Bacchanalia whispered in terror, their voices trembling, that the next knock at the door might be theirs. And in the dark corners of the city, where the scent of wine and resins still lingered, some still swore that Bacchus laughed at Rome's attempt to strangle desire itself. The spectacle was over. The crowd had gone. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was emptiness, heavy and unnatural. A silence that echoed louder than screams. History has a way of burying its dead, but the echoes of their cries never truly fade. The Bacchanalia trials, the executions, the silenced feasts they did not erase indulgence from Rome. They merely forced it deeper underground into darker chambers, whispered in softer voices, hidden beneath thicker veils. Desire cannot be strangled by silk cords, nor silenced by decrees carved into stone. Silphium itself vanished, harvested to extinction, its fields stripped bare until the plant existed only in memory. Some said the gods took it away in anger. Others whispered it was Rome's own greed that destroyed it. Opium, however, endured. Carried along trade routes from the east, it found its way into Roman homes long after the Senate had declared its rites forbidden. Pleasure once condemned returned in new disguises, masked in poetry, cloaked in private salons, wrapped in the secrecy of noble villas. The cycle of repression and indulgence repeated each generation, pretending it was immune, each generation succumbing again. The irony is stark. Rome feared that silphium opium and Bacchic ecstasy would unravel the fabric of the empire. Yet Rome's true destruction came centuries later, not from drugs or secret rites, but from corruption, invasion, and the weight of its own ambition. The Senate's crackdowns silenced women, strangled dissent, and humiliated its own elite, but they did not save Rome. They only left behind a legacy of fear and hypocrisy. And still the shadows of those nights linger. The frescoes of Bacchus in hidden villas, the surviving fragments of whispered testimonies, the knowledge that behind every facade of marble purity lay a hunger too deep to deny. We remember the names of emperors and generals, but the condemned of the Bacchanalia are forgotten, their stories swallowed by the silence Rome demanded. Forgotten but not erased. Their absence is its own kind of presence, a void that reminds us of what Rome tried to hide. Look closer, and you see the pattern repeated across history. Every empire, every age has its gilded cages and its silenced chambers. Every society builds laws to smother desire, then shudders when that desire bursts free. And each time the punishments grow more elaborate, the hypocrisy more grotesque, the silence after more unbearable. So we are left with a question one, as haunting now as it was then, when rulers wage war against human longing itself, against pleasure, against ecstasy, against the very hunger that makes us mortal. Do they protect their world, or do they only hasten its collapse? The forum is silent now. The bodies are gone. The torches are extinguished. But if you listen closely beneath the polished marble of history, you can still hear it. The faint echo of drums, the whisper of Bacchus, the ghostly laughter of those who once dared to seek freedom in the haze of smoke and wine.